it's funny to be here because health, the role that health plays in the deficit strategy and in the government's plans, what you consider that role to be really depends on where you sit. Anyone inside the health service feels that they're absolutely in the eye of the storm and facing just as much pressure as anybody else, if not more, for a wide variety of reasons. On the outside, of course, people think that health is sitting pretty and actually making things much harder for everyone else. If you do a sort of, if you do what you really shouldn't do, which is just to do a chart of the share of health spending as a proportion of government spending, for many people sitting in the rest of government, it looks like health, given the so-called protection of health, really is just going to take more and more of the pie if some change doesn't happen in the next few years. But I know that it doesn't feel like the days of plenty for anyone inside the health service. But I'm really glad that we've got this session, we've got the setup of all those great charts, and then I think we can hear from a number of different voices on what the challenges are for the economy and how health fits into that at a national and global level, how globally the challenges are sort of measuring up. We've already had a little bit of that, but we're going to have more of that from the OECD. How all of that turns into a challenge for the government in terms of ratings. We've come to believe that those three letters, one of which we lost recently, the AAA, we lost one of them at least from one ratings agency, are very important, and that things like health are now becoming on the radar of ratings agencies in a way perhaps they wouldn't have been a few years ago. And then one key area that we've already touched on slightly, which obviously plays a big role for lots of countries, is social care. We'll have something on that with really the top people to talk about this. Everyone's going to give a short presentation. You can see, guys, when you look at the running order, we've got very little time for Q&A and not that much time for the presentations. So I know you're all very disciplined people, but be disciplined, please. And when you're not being disciplined, please don't do what everyone does in those circumstances and fail to catch my eye when I'm trying desperately to shut you up. But I think we're going to have some great presentations, and I hope the quality of questions that we've already heard, I hope has not discouraged you from leaving plenty of time for questions. But first up, Andrew Sentence, who will be familiar to many of you from his time at the Monetary Policy Committee, who's now a Senior Economic Advisor to PwC and a Professorial Fellow at the Centre for Study of Globalisation and Regionalisation at Warwick. You will have heard a lot about him over the last few years because he did occupy quite a lonely position in the MPC, raising questions about the Bank of England's policy and the risks of inflation, really at a time when others were not thinking about that. And I think there's some people who have increasingly, maybe history will look more kindly on your votes than perhaps people did at the time. But Andrew Sentence, thank you very much. You come now.
Good. Well, thanks very much. And it's nice to know I might have history on my side. That's a real compliment. Thanks, Stephanie. What I want to talk about is what I've been asked to talk about is the global economy, and to put in context some of the challenges that you've already heard a bit about, and you'll be talking about for much of the rest of this summit. When I talk about the global economy and the UK economy, I set it in this framework of what I'm calling the new normal. It's not an original phrase. And I suppose your initial reaction might be, well, what's this guy calling anything normal for, that it doesn't feel very normal to me? And there's clearly been a very big shift in terms of the way in which economies have been performing, in the way in which pressures have manifested themselves on public finances and the various parts of the economy. But the reason for using the phrase the new normal is that many of the transitions that have taken place are things that we're going to have to adjust to over a long period of time. So it's not like this is a cyclical phenomenon that's just going on a bit longer than we might have expected, and we're going back to the old normal, the old trends. And while this manifests itself in different ways in different sectors, it's something that all sectors of the economy, I think, have to take on board. Now, in setting the scene for this, we've already heard a bit about different trends in emerging market economies and the developed economies. But I just want to start with this slide, because if you read the press, the perception is that the world economy is not growing, it's in a very difficult position, and that things are pretty stagnant and difficult. And that's true of some parts of the world economy, particularly in Europe at the moment, which is right on our doorstep, and some parts of the UK economy. But if you look in the aggregate and take a sort of satellite view of the world economy, and just look at what's been going on over the last decade or so, and what's expected to happen over the next 5 years. And I've put the IMF's figures up here, so they can't be challenged by a previous speaker, though they will be updated. They're always being updated. I think they're due for another update. But back in 2000, the world economy was worth about $32 trillion. And even by 2008, it had almost doubled in size in that period of strong growth. Already, we're about 15% above that at $71 trillion. And when we get to 2017, we're likely to be in a world economy which is nearly 3 times the size in money terms that it was back in 2000. And that is quite a significant development. But of course, different parts of the world economy are growing at very different rates, as we already heard. And if we look at the 3 main regions of the world economy, North America, United States, the European Union, and the Asia-Pacific region, they have for some time been growing at quite significantly different rates, and that's particularly noticeable over the last couple of years. And this is unusual coming out of a recession, that we see such strong growth in the emerging and developing economies in general. And this is significant from 2 points of view. One is that the emerging and developing economies, because of the development that's already taken place in many key economies like China, India, Indonesia, Latin America and so on, are already roughly about half of the world economy, put more broadly. But we've not actually been in a position where their growth has been so strong at an early phase of the economic recovery. And you might initially think that this is going to be a good thing for Western economies, but I think it's a very mixed blessing for the more mature, developed economies. For some businesses that are well orientated towards those growth opportunities that can export into those markets, it's clearly a positive. But in other ways, we're seeing some negatives in terms of the squeeze that this is putting on Western economies. And in particular, the upward pressure on energy and commodity prices, and I'll come back to this, is a very important feature of our world at the moment. I don't think that's going to disappear quickly. We've never before been in a world economy where we've had over 7 billion people, all of whom are participating in the world economy. And we're also seeing a big shift in the center of gravity across the world economy. The Asia-Pacific economies are becoming the most significant region and the driver of global economic activity. Now, if we look back to the 19th century, we would have seen Europe as being the main driver of global economic activity. If we looked at the 20th century, the baton was passed to the United States, and towards the end of the 20th century, the United States seemed to be the major driver of the world economy. But we're now moving to a position, or we probably already have moved to a position, where the Asia-Pacific region, with its big population, over 50% of the world's population lives in this region, with its super economies like China and India and Indonesia, who are beginning to realize their potential, exerting much more weight on the world stage. And the UK is not exempt, clearly, from these pressures. We've got a situation in the major developed economies where we're not just reeling from the shocks created by the financial crisis, but there are various other issues that are making growth more difficult in the current environment. The cost of stuff that we're buying from the rest of the world has gone up because of higher energy and commodity prices and because of the decline in the value of the pound. That's one factor. We're also seeing economies need to restructure, and so the areas that were strong growth in the past are not very well positioned to deliver strong growth in the future, and that is also contributing to weakness in growth. But as Stephanie reminded us, counter to what many economists suggested, this is not a relatively weak growth phase for the West. which is being accompanied by deflation, falling prices. It's being accompanied by relatively high inflation. And that is part of the equation which is squeezing consumers and perhaps squeezing some other parts of the economy, driven by these rises in energy and commodity prices, driven from the fact that in this emerging and developing world, which is growing strongly, wage increases are relatively high, and therefore the cost of stuff that we're buying from them is also going up in price, and exacerbated in the case of the UK by the fact that the value of our currency has gone down. So that sort of sets the scene for my view of the new normal, and let me say what I mean by that. The picture I want to put to you is that we've been in a phase of growth, particularly in the UK, but I think more generally in the Western economies, that lasted for 20 to 25 years. You can trace its roots back into the 1980s, and the forces that underpin that have come to an end. And we're now in a prolonged period of structural adjustment. And the last time in the Western economies we were in a similar period was in the period from the early 70s to the early 80s, when a previous long expansion came to an end. And just to illustrate that point, this is what I sort of call my killer slide from this presentation. We're not used to perhaps looking at our economy in this way, but we had a long period in the UK and a quarter of a century of expansion, lasting from the late 40s until the early 70s, growth of around about 3%. That then gave way to a period of volatility and slow growth in the 70s and early 80s. And then growth picked up again, and we had another sort of fairly strong growth period from the early 80s through to 2007. And we've now moved into a period where, if you take into account the recession and the slow growth that we've had more recently, the growth picture looks much, much more like that 70s to early 80s period, rather than a return to that those skyscraper bars that we saw. And my view is, I think we should expect to be in this economic environment of relatively disappointing growth and volatility in the major Western economies for some time. Now, how has that happened? How did we transition from this relatively benign growth environment to one where we're struggling to find growth? And yes, you can talk about the shocks that we've seen in the world economy from the financial crisis and rising energy prices. But essentially, in terms of the underlying conditions in which economic growth takes place in Western economies like the UK, there are three big differences that I can see from where we are now to where we were before 2007. We had an environment of essentially easy money, cheap imports, and confidence in the ability of governments and central banks to keep economies on a steady track. And we've moved away from that to a world where banks are being much more cautious, the financial system has been disrupted by the crisis, and regulators are requiring banks and the financial system to operate in a more cautious way. The cheap imports were the beneficial side effect for the West from the vast globalization of the world economy that took place in the 1990s and 2000s. But we're now seeing the flip side of that with these energy and commodity price rises. So we're no longer in a world that is so benign for consumer spending for that reason. And obviously the confidence that people could have in the private sector, in businesses and consumers, that we could keep our economies on a steady and even course has been undermined by the shocks of the financial crisis and the difficulty in responding to them. So this leaves us, in my view, facing a fairly prolonged period, which I'm calling in this slide the sort of phase one of the new normal for Western economies, which is disappointing Western growth alongside this relatively healthy growth we're seeing in the rest of the world economy in the emerging markets, persistent financial volatility, and continuing high and fluctuating energy and commodity prices. But I'm not known for being a notably pessimistic economist, and I want to say that at some point, I think we should have confidence that the Western economies will complete some of the adjustment that is underway at the moment, the adjustment in public finances, the adjustment in the financial system, the adjustment in the structure of the economy to orientate itself to new sources of growth such as in emerging markets. And we could, in the second half of this decade, and I wouldn't put it any earlier than that, transition into a phase 2 where there is a more sustained growth dynamic. Now, you notice I'm not saying on this slide where these new growth drivers are coming from, because we're very uncertain. But I think I'm pretty confident in asserting that they won't be the same growth drivers that I showed you on the previous slide. Just as the period of growth that we saw starting in the 80s was different from the 50s and 60s, so we should expect a more sustained period of growth for Western economies to be different from what we saw pre-2007. Now, that contains opportunities for businesses and for sectors to consider whether the developments in technology or in new types of business activity in your sector could be part of that new growth dynamic. And essentially what I see happening in this period of restructuring that we're in the phase 1 of the new normal is economies that had a fairly established growth dynamic which has been disrupted are now struggling to identify and find new sources of growth. I just want to say a bit more about that just at the end, but just let me move on from that to say what does that mean that the growth outlook looks like for the world economy. And it is, for the foreseeable future, this is looking at forecasts for this year, and given that the weather's turned miserable again, we're back in Europe on this slide. We're seeing very mixed fortunes as you look across the global economy. Generally speaking, in emerging and developing economies, though they've had a slowdown, they're still doing pretty well. And we had a seminar at PwC yesterday about growth in Africa, which is not a place we've been customarily looking for rapid growth. Africa is actually one of its strongest growth phases since the 1970s. But the noticeable thing on this slide is the problems, particularly in Europe, and the relatively slow growth that we're seeing across the Western world more generally. And hopefully I've explained that as being a situation where the old drivers of that growth have gone away. Economies are in a process of restructuring and having to find new sources of growth, and we will take some time to emerge from that. If we look at what's going on within Europe, we're in a position where actually the fact that southern European economies, if you put France in southern Europe or ally France with southern Europe, and that's a bit of a something that some people wouldn't agree with, but it just helps to classify the economies perhaps a bit more clearly. France and southern Europe, which did better than northern and eastern Europe before the financial crisis, are now really struggling. And that's really what's dragging down the European growth performance. As you can see, if you look at Germany and northern Europe, including Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, it's going through a bit of a dip, but is expected to pick up. And I suppose the encouraging thing from the UK's point of view is we look to be on these forecasts, which are not mine, they're from the European Commission, on the slightly more positive side of that divide. But the economic climate here in the UK is going to be noticeably different in some areas. And the area that I would pinpoint particularly is consumer-facing businesses. Now, I'm not sure how health classes itself in terms of being a consumer-facing business, but this is really private consumer spending I'm talking about. But certainly the growth of consumer spending that we're likely to see in the mid-2010s is about half of what we might have seen before the crisis. So what does this all mean for how businesses, individual sectors like health might be thinking about things in the current climate? And this is a slide that I use to sort of try and draw out these business implications for when I'm talking to different boards and different sectors. And I did think of doing a health-specific version of this, but then I thought, well, actually, I think many of these bullet points really do relate to some of the challenges that you're facing in the health sector. Perhaps parts of the health sector that are very nationally focused have a limited ability to reposition towards Asia and emerging markets. But even there, the strong growth, that is what is going to drive strong growth in health demand in those economies with the growth of emerging middle classes. Innovation, exploitation of new technology in a whole host of ways, I think, is going to be critical in the health sector, and indeed, to my mind, is critical to the way in which we might transition ultimately into a more strong growth phase in the UK and other Western economies. Understanding the structural change in markets and adapting business models to work alongside them and ensuring and providing a strong value proposition to customers. And in a world of relatively high energy prices to make efficient use of energy and natural resources. So that's a quick overview of what I'm calling the new normal. In the short term, it's disappointing growth in the West and continued volatility. But there is this prospect that as the Western economies restructure and obviously deal with some of the pressures on public finances, we can transition into a stronger period of growth, a more sustained period of growth. And looking for the opportunities that are emerging in the current climate is perhaps one important component as part of that transition. Thank you very much.
Can I ask you quickly, because I think it's also relevant to people here. I love another set of fantastic charts. It's going to be very hard to tear me away from all this. I hope that this isn't a sign of how great all the charts are going to be for the rest of the day.
Looking forward to seeing them all on your blog, Stephanie.
I will be stealing them all, including the weather chart, which I think is brilliant. Can I just ask you, because I think it is quite relevant to people here, you have that very interesting chart showing bringing us with a comparison to the 70s rather than the comparison that people many make to the 30s. But as you say yourself, the sort of upside of that is that you are suggesting it's a short-term or at least a medium-term phenomenon, not a permanent phenomenon, this slower growth. The subtext of a lot of these discussions, and it's obviously relevant for people who are putting in 5, 10, 15-year forecasts, is that this is as good as it's going to get almost for the developed economies because of ageing, because of the lack of because of the rising share of the public sector and the lack of scope for productivity growth. You're sort of sounding, although you're not very specific, you're sounding as though you're not one of those sort of long-term pessimists. It's not that our long-term growth is now going to be our potential growth rate is maybe 0.5 or 1%. We could still go back. We're just going to take a long time.
I'm not sure that we're going to go back for some of the reasons that you've talked about, like demographics, and some of the moving to a more service-orientated economy, in my view, brings with it slower productivity growth for a whole host of reasons. But I suppose what I'm counselling against is seeing the last 2 or 3 years as being, that's it. That, yes, we're going to have a period of relatively weak growth, perhaps sort of 1–1.5% would be quite good over the next few years. When we get into the second half of the decade, we may well have started to come through some of the things that are holding things back at the moment, such as the very negative trends in the financial sector, some of the restructuring of public finances. I think the key to my mind, though, is having the confidence to let markets adjust and to let businesses adjust and restructure. And I think one of the dangers I think many economies face, particularly those with large public sectors like the UK, is that not enough adjustment takes place because resources are still locked up in particular areas of where they've historically been. So we have to have the confidence in terms of the way we manage our economies to allow markets to operate and to allow those adjustments to take place. And I think that's one of the big challenges, particularly in the public sector.
I mean, we might hear more about this later, but I think that's one of the interesting features of this sort of Swedish experience. People are now increasingly going back to the Swedish model. The amount of restructuring and change that they did in what their government does of how their public spending is allocated, I think is often underestimated. They actually they're still spending a lot relative to a lot of other countries, but they're spending on very different things than they were spending on 10 or 20 years ago, and that's sort of an interesting reflection. But thank you very much, Andrew. Okay. Right, I'm going to stay here, so we'll sort of speed things up a bit. Mark Pearson, who I'm sure many of you know, head of the health division at OECD, I think is going to sort of move on quite smoothly from what Andrew's been saying, but with more of a focus on health and value for money.
Very good. Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, indeed. In many respects, what I want to pick up on is the starting point is Andrew's chart, the one that you called your killer chart, where you showed the big skyscrapers up till the crisis and then this horrible, very low number going on, I think you had till 2016, 2017. The reason why I want to start with that chart, which I would love to show you again, is because that huge skyscraper, during that period, health spending per person in developed countries went up 3 times more rapidly than income per person. So that huge skyscraper multiplied by 3, that's what you were getting was happening to health spending per person, if you did the comparison before the crisis. It's all come to a juddering halt. About 2 years ago, health spending, for the first time, on average in developed countries, did not grow anymore. And that's the first time that we've ever managed to see that since the records began. I love saying that, since records began. In the 1960s, first time that health spending on average hasn't grown. You know, you're a fool if you do projections of health spending into the future. The IMF does them, the European Commission does them, I do them. We're all fools. For what it's worth, our projections are that health spending will be going up by about 1% of GDP per decade in a typical developed country. And in addition, another 0.5% per decade, 0.5% of GDP per decade for long-term care. So there's a huge pressure on spending. There's been a massive amount of extra money going into health before the crisis. Did outputs and outcomes keep pace during that period? Well, no, of course they didn't. If we look at productivity in the health sector, it's dreadful over the period before the crisis. Of course, measuring productivity in the health sector is incredibly difficult. Lots of adjustments could be made, but let's face it, if you make all the adjustments, you might manage to claim that the health productivity was merely mediocre. If you don't make all the adjustments, it's downright catastrophic. One way or the other, health spending was not happening efficiently. The extra money going into health, the model of how we were trying to improve health in developed countries, of simply doing more health, providing more money, rather than trying to deliver value for money, was a recipe for incredibly rapid cost growth. And it won't happen in the future. Now, I have in basically about 10 minutes to try and provide some evidence on achieving better value for money in healthcare. And that's going to be tough. So I'm going to just focus on 2 bits of evidence. The first is going to be on a general study that we did, and Dr. Shafiq's already referred to this in her presentation, which tried to compare the efficiency of health systems across developed countries to see if we could say anything about what set of policies might work. The second bit of evidence I'm going to give you is on what's been happening in the countries most affected by the economic crisis. What reforms have they been doing? And the reason why I'm doing that is because health reforms don't happen very often. You have very small reforms going on, but in terms of looking at big pictures, things move quite slowly across countries. And in fact, particularly in recessions, generally we find in recessions that reforms slow down health reforms, unlike in other areas of policy. So the reason for focusing on the countries most affected by the crisis is that at least they've been forced to do something, so we get a little bit more evidence. So let me start with that first bit of evidence I want to talk about, where what we've tried to do is to really look at this op-ed, a type of approach to reform. You know, this idea, why oh why can't we have more competition and turn ourselves into the Dutch system of health? Or why oh why can't we, I don't know, integrate healthcare and social care better and turn ourselves into Sweden? So what we did was to classify countries into different groups. We did this in lots of different ways. This is our preferred way. So countries which are relatively similar to each other, we put in particular groups. So, you know, the UK is in a group, mostly public provision, gatekeeping, choice of users is quite widespread, but very strict budget constraints. And that contrasts with, say, France, where you have a market for provision. You have a basic insurance provided by the public sector, but lots of private insurance still in the system. So we've grouped our developed countries into different categories. And then what we do is that we try and compare how efficient the countries are. Now, I could spend a long time describing how we try to look at the efficiency across countries. It's very difficult to do. It's the weakest part of our analysis, so I'm therefore going to skate over it very rapidly and ask you to take this on trust. And what we've done is therefore in this chart, I've looked at the potential gains in efficiency if a country became as efficient as the most efficient theoretical country. So in theory, if the UK managed to be as efficient as it could possibly be, people would be living round about 3 years longer than they currently are. That's how you have to read this chart. And we've done these calculations for each country and grouped them into their 6 categories that I showed you earlier. 2 things I want to draw your attention to. The first is, well, the UK isn't doing particularly well there. It's actually not a particularly efficient country. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is that, more importantly, it's just not obvious that any one group performs better than any other group. You know, so this idea that if why, oh why can't we just turn ourselves into the Dutch? Well, the Dutch are okay. It'd be even better if we could turn ourselves into Switzerland, but we run a risk that we might turn ourselves into Slovakia and make things worse. And in each of these groups, you have some countries which turn out to be very efficient, and some countries that turn out to be very inefficient, even though they have similar basic policies in place. And that suggests it's really not about the big picture reforms. I mean, the idea that somehow if you just throw the whole system up and restructure it entirely, somehow you're going to find the golden goose and we're going to have a fantastic health system. That does not seem to be the case. It's how well you manage to run the system you've got. And when you look in more detail, it does seem to be those little things like the coherence of the system. So, you know, are your payments systems coherent across the different sectors? Not about how much private provision you've got in the system as a whole. Now, that suggests that you really need to focus on just making the current system better rather than looking for something which we don't believe exists, which is the ideal health system. Now, this particular work has created a whole industry out there of lots of people using these numbers to try and find particular policies which are generally good across countries. And you can say in a more positive way, these are things that you should be doing. In fact, you know, the IMF report uses these numbers and turns them into some sort of model to look at different policy recommendations. For what it's worth, I think the thing that comes out of all those studies, and by now there's 20 or so that have tried to do this, one thing does come out quite strongly, which is that provider choice seems to have an impact. So being able to choose which GP or which hospital does seem to be related to greater efficiency. Beyond that, I think basically we can say this coherence of objectives across the system is important. It's very difficult to say anything else on these sort of broad picture comparisons across countries. So instead, let me move on to my second bit of evidence to look at this issue of value for money, which is to look at really what countries that have been most hit by the public expenditure crisis have been doing in health, to see if there's any obvious impact on health outcomes that may be relevant in terms of thinking about how we should be looking at the reform of our health system. And I should acknowledge here that some of the numbers and evidence that I'm going to show actually comes from WHO Europe. Thank you very much, Tamas. So what we've done is look at the 9 countries, that's most developed countries, that seem to be most affected by the economic crisis. And I've divided the reforms that they've done into 5 areas. The first one is to look at what's been happening to financing and revenues. And indeed, you know, some countries have sought to protect health spending by increasing particular taxes and tying them explicitly to trying to protect health spending. That doesn't necessarily mean earmarking, just means tying it. And you've also seen a few countries done huge cuts in the ministerial budgets, by which we mean the central ministry, not the total health. So there's been a bit going on in terms of raising more money. I think more interesting is what's been happening to coverage. You have seen in a number of countries that they've started to exclude some people from coverage, particularly foreigners. But you've seen the biggest change has been a very large increase in co-payments in lots of countries. Now, the cuts in the number of people covered, these are incredibly controversial in the countries concerned. Surprisingly, the co-payments haven't been as controversial, even though you have seen these very, very large increases. And this is despite the fact that if you had to pick one area of likely reforms which are going to have very little impact on value for money and indeed might make things worse in the health system, you'd probably pick co-payments. There is very, very little evidence that co-payments can improve the efficiency of health systems. There is quite a lot that it can worsen it. There's even quite a lot that it can actually increase the amounts of spending as money gets shifted to different areas of the health system. So it's very disappointing that we have seen a reliance on increased co-payments going on in so many countries. Are there any obvious adverse effects from all this? It does depend on the country. Some countries, we haven't yet seen any obvious adverse effects. In some, you are seeing now an increase in reports of unmet care needs going up. So that's a rather negative story. The other big area where you've seen an impact is on wages and prices in the health sector, where there have been large cuts in salaries in many countries and large and often unilateral cuts in the prices paid for pharmaceuticals. I feel very positive about this set of policies. I think these are the obvious things to do if you want to protect frontline services in order to make sure you continue to have good quality of care for your population during a crisis. And let's face it, one of the ways out of recession eventually will be that wages have to adjust. It seems reasonable that you look to public sector wages as well. However, it is clear that there are long-term effects from cutting both wages and pharmaceuticals, less so in the case of pharmaceuticals. And more to the point, this is a one-off effect. It saves you money, but it's not going to bend the cost curve. All we're doing here is saving some money off the budget. So I think the best way of thinking about these sorts of policies is to buy yourself time in order to do something more structural. I have to also, just for the sake of completeness, mention that there have been quantity reductions. Obviously, these have an effect on frontline services. There have been big reductions in staff in many countries. And we have, unfortunately, seen fairly large increases in waiting times as a result in countries like Portugal. But what about the most interesting areas? What about structural changes, things that countries have done that really does seem to try to make the system better value for money? And there's been less than we'd have liked to have seen. There's been bits and pieces in a few countries. There have been reform of hospital payments in the Czech Republic. That's basically moving to case-based payments. There has been primary care payments moving towards capitation payments in Portugal. But the other big thing that's happened has been a forced merger of hospitals, forced merger of hospital districts, centralization of purchasing, centralization of management of things like accident and emergency. I found this interesting because we've often talked about the need for many years to close excess hospital beds. Finally, some countries are managing to use the recession to do this. But I think it's particularly interesting here because I think it's fair to say there's been a trend towards centralization in these countries, quite the opposite of what's been happening in the UK. So these countries, faced by massive budgetary pressures, have responded by trying to centralize in order to get efficiency in their spending. UK has gone down quite a different route, and it may be interesting to discuss why the UK has chosen such a different route. I've now run out of time, so I need to conclude. And let me conclude very quickly some things that I think you might want to take away. Yes, England's health system efficiency is not great, but I haven't got a magic formula. There is no big picture model which is obviously superior. That said, there are some particular policies which I think are coming out of international comparisons that are well worth following through, and as I say, provider choice seems to be the strongest message that comes from these international comparisons. The crisis countries did go very much down the route of cutting prices and wages, and it hasn't had yet particularly negative effects, unlike some of the other things that they have done. But they haven't used that time that they've bought by cutting prices and wages enough in order to do structural reforms. There have been, and the last 2 points I'm going to mention because I couldn't resist it, even though they're not actually flowing naturally from the rest of my presentation. The 2 areas that I suspect there would be some sort of consensus amongst people who look at health systems where there is most potential for driving gains in value for money are probably in payment reform and in the health labour market. Payment reform, there are bits and pieces happening. You know, there's experiments with bundling, further movements towards DRGs. So there's bits happening, but it's still very, very tentative across countries. On the health labour market, there's nothing. Nobody seems to be tackling this desperately inefficient system that we have of training physicians for 10 years, stuffing them in particular boxes with scope of practice rules. The production function for health is stuck in a very, very old-fashioned model. It is the obvious place where you're going to get efficiency, especially in light of what I talked about earlier about the catastrophically, or maybe only mediocre, labour productivity performance in the health sector. So why aren't we seeing reforms in how we structure the health labour market? And I would love it if somebody could tell me why. Thank you very much.
Well, there's lots there that I'd like to get into, but we've got a nice segue now because we've heard what all of these countries have been trying to do to squeeze their health spending. Now we hear whether one of the major ratings agencies thinks it makes any difference to their sovereign credibility or not. Marko Mrznik, whose job it really is as director of the European Department for Sovereigns at Standard & Poor's to think about just these issues. Marko.
Thank you very much, everyone. At Standard & Poor's, we have been dealing with challenges of sustainability to public finances, for several years now. Every now and then we actually publish a report on trends looking into the future. And while this is not, of course, a prediction of ratings, say, 10 years from now or something like that, it gives us an indication of what is going on in about 49 countries in the world in this context. I would like to start by saying that when we look at the sustainability of public finances, say from this demographic point of view, we're not considering just the shift in population structure. We're talking about the policies. We're talking about the political structure, societal tissue that is linking all together. And in this context, what we're observing is that the consequences of the aging population will have dramatic implications for the public finances if there is no policy change, of course. The trends that we see here, they are based on the IMF, OECD, and European Commission projections, tell us that on the basis of our current policies, the situation is quite clearly unsustainable. And at the same time, as we saw earlier on, one of the charts from the NHS and also heard from the first interview, raising taxes does not seem to be the most desirable option, and it may actually prove increasingly difficult to do so, especially if the economic outlook turns out to be as predicted by one of our panelists. Now, while it appears that pension-related spending gets kind of constrained by the policy action through pension reforms, we seem to believe that the projections on the healthcare spending are turning quite into a warning dynamics, reflecting also non-demographic drivers such as technology and growing coverage, of course, of health treatments. And to show you the magnitude of the challenge that, say, the aging spending presents in the future, in the overall age-related spending increases, just look at the dots, the black dots that show you this proportion of increase in total age-related spending over the period of the next 50 years, that is actually due to solely, therefore, due to healthcare spending increases. And as you can see, in many of the countries, many of the advanced economies, we see that healthcare increases would represent more than 50% of total age-related spending increases over the next 40 years. In particular, we see that the case in the US. We also see the case happening in the UK, France, Italy, Australia. So there are quite a number of advanced economies that seem to be where the pressure on their healthcare spending is likely to increase in the coming decades. Now, Standard & Poor's being a rating agency, what we wanted to do is actually to translate this budgetary consequences of population aging or systemic picture into ratings. Again, this is based on very much hypothetical scenario simulation. We prepared actually a small, very simplified model of, say, rating, including GDP developments, but also fiscal and debt structure going forward in order to, say, illustrate what is likely to happen if there's no change. We do not rate according to a model. We don't have a model to rate, so this is quite an illustrative exercise, different from what we do on a daily basis. Nevertheless, let me just explain quickly. This is a collective chart for 49 world economies. So these 49 world economies represent more than 3/4 of the world GDP. So this is quite representative of the world situation. And as you can see, as the spending pressure increases, the deficits rise, therefore the debt also will increase. We see the dynamics of creditworthiness quite in adverse terms. As you can see, AAA to BBB, a bit of alphabet here. This represents so-called investment grade categories. This would be, say, the good part. I mean, good creditworthiness, creditworthy country. The other ones are less creditworthy, so speculative grades. And what we see in the case of no policy change scenario, so the countries do not engage into additional structural reforms. They do not consolidate their budgets, so their fiscal situation as it is just keeps on rolling on as, you know, with large deficits. We see a massive erosion of creditworthiness, in particular after 2020, when this, or 25, when this area of speculative grade ratings starts to increase and widens. And at the end of the period, we have 50% of the sample in speculative grade territory. We hardly have AAAs at the end of it. Actually, we don't have anyone at the end of the period. But it seems that on the no policy change scenario, there's actually quite a dramatic erosion in creditworthiness.
Can I just confirm, that's no policy change on all age-related or just health?
That's on all age-related.
All age-related.
Yeah. I mean, no policy change or on age-related spending or budgetary stance.
Oh, anything. Okay.
Yeah. So this is a picture of what is not going to happen, I think. So basically, to qualify a bit, what is the importance, what is the significance of healthcare trends in the overall structure of age-related spending, and therefore the implication for creditworthiness? We simulated the same results but without actually healthcare reform. So there's no budgetary consolidation, but we do expect, say, the countries to freeze their pension, their long-term care spending in 2050 at their 2010 level. Very illusionist, I know, very utopian, but say it's just for the exercise to observe what is actually the significance of healthcare dynamics in the future and what is the implication of debt for creditworthiness. And here you see that actually there's little difference between this chart and the previous one, which gives you really an idea how important the changes to the healthcare systems are in order to improve the sustainability of public finances going forward. I think without these changes, without improvements in that sense, it's likely that public finances will suffer quite a lot. And finally, what we did was say, what if we expect, say, the countries to balance their budgets by 2016, which is, again, very optimistic assumption. But some will, actually. You know, Germany, for example, has a constitutional rule kicking in 2016, so there's no doubt about that. But at the same time, we see also age-related spending reforms without, again, healthcare reform going forward. So healthcare spending is the only variable that continues to grow in line with the projections that we saw in, on the first slide. And what we can see that it's only this policy mix that actually stabilizes the erosion or stabilizes the creditworthiness at the current level, because say the categories, rating categories don't move so dynamically as we saw previously. So actually the healthcare component is so potent, it's so strong that only a mix in a scenario of full budgetary consolidation and on top of that full age-related spending reform would be able to contain. Maybe a word on say what's been going on lately. As we have already heard, a number of countries have been actually under significant market pressure to simultaneously reform their policies, their social security systems, and at the same time undertake a radical budgetary consolidation. In many cases, this led to cuts in healthcare, something that has created a significant strain, of course, tension between the electorate and, of course, the state. In some cases where these changes were done overnight without an appropriate consultation process, without inviting all the relevant stakeholders and consult them for their opinion. For example, recent cases of overnight privatizations in Spain come to my mind. This will continue to create tensions and will make possibly situation difficult, not only in political terms. I mean, there's possibly little guarantee that such a reform can be sustainable or successful in the long term. I'm looking forward to the debate now. Thank you.
Of course, Mark and I have been sort of taking bets about who it is you think will still have the AAA in 2045. We're fairly convinced it's not the UK, but we'll...
Norway.
Norway. Norway? Okay, it was Norway or Singapore we thought. We like.
No.
I think we've covered so much ground, and I think in each... There's been so many nuggets in each of these presentations. We've ended up, it's all been very complementary without too much overlap at all. And I think that the final presentation will do something similar from Anita Charlesworth, who'll be familiar to many of you, the chief economist of Nuffield. It's focusing on social care, which is not a small piece of some of these challenges. NHS and social care. Sorry.
I'm going to be very parochial now, and I'm going to focus on England, and I'm going to focus on health and social care. And very briefly, this is my everything you ever wanted to know about public finances on one chart. It's the last 35 years, and the black line is what's happened to tax receipts. And you see that essentially tax as a share of GDP has fallen. Public spending as a share of GDP had fallen prior to the crisis, then went back up to about 46%. And in response to that burgeoning in the deficit, what you then see is from the late peak of public spending, a significant fiscal consolidation, where public spending is bearing the brunt of that consolidation, tax rising very, very little, and that's obviously the environment we're operating in. Underneath that big macro picture, my light blue bar is spending as a share of GDP on health. And through that period where public spending fell, and tax fell, health grew from 4.4% of GDP, this is public spending on health, to over 7%. So I call this the magic circle. So from 78, 79 up to the crisis, public spending fell by 4.4% of GDP. Receipts, so that's the tax burden, fell by 1.5%, and health spending grew. And I think this is a really important part of the political economy context for where we sit now, because for at least a generation, the public's experience has been that you can pay less tax, cut spending, and increase health substantially. Yeah? And that's a lovely political message, isn't it? But I think I would argue that that's probably come to an end. Yeah? But it's quite difficult at the moment in that I'm not sure that the public understands that that has come to an end. Yeah? And the reason why we were able to do that was, in part, actually, we've been spending more consistently than we've got in tax receipts. But also, actually, what you see is other public service spending as a share of GDP fell dramatically. We've had major compositional changes in what the public service does. Yeah? So we've halved defence spending as a share of GDP with the Cold War dividend. Many areas of economic activity, the utilities, etc., were privatised, taken out of the public sector. It's quite difficult. It's more than quite difficult. It's almost impossible, actually, I think, really, to conceive of that continuing in an easy way over the next period. So it does feel to me like we are at one of those, at a break point there. And so there are two key differences, I think, now what we face. So in 2016, spending as a share of GDP and receipts as a share of GDP will be back at around the average of the last 20 years. So we seem to spend about 40% crises apart, and we seem to raise about 38% of GDP in tax. There will be two key differences, though. Health spending is a much larger share of that pie. And the other thing is, spending on other public services by this period will be down at the levels seen at the end of the 1990s. And if you remember there, that was a point at which there was a really significant degree of public anxiety about the quality of our public space and our public services, which again leads you to question how much further can you go after that period in cutting other public services. And then added into the mix is obviously debt interest rising on the back of that. So this is a Treasury chart, lots of jargon. The black line is total public spending coming down to 40%. We fish in the pool, which is DEL, Departmental Expenditure Limits. There's also annually managed expenditure, which is spending on debt interest, social security, etc. That's rise. What's happening, you see, is that that's staying pretty constant as a share of GDP. So actually, departmental spending is taking a very substantial amount of the strain, which makes the trying to protect health even more difficult. Yeah. So where we are at the moment, obviously, is living with flat real up to 2014-15. We've modelled this in the piece of work that we published in December. This is based on about 80% of health spending, which is all the money allocated out to PCTs. We estimate the quick challenge at about 13 billion, less than the Department of Health talks about. Very significant chunk of that, about 5 billion, we estimate, comes from the current pay policy. So we're reasonably optimistic about the ability of the NHS to deliver through this period, very significantly helped by the pay environment and the contribution of the pay environment. And certainly the work we've looked at in terms of what's going on in services is far too busy a slide. If we look in 2011-12, what we did see there was, against what we might expect based on trend, that actually emergency admissions, emergency bed days, these were all coming in lower than was expected, although we were seeing a rise in higher than expected A&E attendances and outpatient appointments. Some sense in which, the NHS was maybe doing something, although the 12-13 picture, when I was looking at midway through, doesn't look anywhere near as positive, and we're seeing emergency admissions rising again. The work we published earlier this week looked at so the NHS is coping at the moment. What's happening to labour productivity? This is looking at about 110 acute hospitals and the variation between them in productivity and the variation over time. We don't see any significant improvement in productivity. We see broadly flat labour productivity, very crude measure, no quality adjustment. What we do see is some narrowing in the of the range of productivity, but we still see a quite significant range in productivity. So the pessimistic scenario is it's not improving. The optimistic scenario is some people are performing much better, so there is scope there. The other thing that people have talked about is the need for structural change and not the sort of, rearranging the deck system reform. One of the things that I think is something we really need to start to think about is the balance of different types of service and whether we've got the composition of, whether we've got resources in the right place. And the work we published earlier this week was looking at what areas of spending have we been growing within the health budget. And certainly over the last 2 years, as we started to embrace this need for more efficiency, I see quite a mixed picture that doesn't necessarily look as strategic as it might do, given what we say about what are the sort of ingredients that we need to improve long-term efficiency, about moving care closer to home, upstreaming care towards more focus on prevention, earlier detection. So good news part of that is we see a big increase in community health service spending, although the measurement of what actually we're doing in community health service is dire, to use a technical term. It's very difficult to know what's actually being bought there. But hospital services growing at a faster rate still than the overall increase in resources, whilst we're having real-term cuts in GP services. And I don't know at the moment what the right mix is between these areas, but if I had to hazard a guess from what people say is their strategy and what we need to change in the system, I wouldn't have guessed that this was the sort of change in allocation of resources that would result from what people articulate as the ingredients of a more efficient system. Looking forward over the next 5 years and up to 2017, beyond this spending review, very difficult to manage anything other than an increase in the FRAP real at the moment. That's probably the best outcome we can expect from the spending review. Continuing on with some of the sort of QIP initiatives that are underway will help us a bit. We estimate that that's probably, this is in 10, 11 prices, about another 4% per annum per year. But without pay restraint, this starts to become very challenging again. And just to finish, looking at the outlook for earnings, nominal pay growth in the health service is low at the moment by historic levels. It's slightly lower than nominal average earnings growth, but not completely out of reach. It's certainly at the moment for for health service workers, as with private sector workers looking at below inflation. The challenge, I think, if we have another 3 years of flat real, is what happens to the pay outlook. Assuming we get some growth, as Andrew talked about, in the second half of this decade, the OBR forecasts are for average earnings across the economy to pick up from 2015 onwards. Obviously, if the health service follows that, then the efficiency challenge is much bigger. So I would just echo then Mark's point then, that at the moment we've also almost got false reassurance that this is deliverable because of the contribution of the pay environment. Do need to start to think very urgently, given the lead times around workforce reform, about how we're going to improve labour productivity and how we can manage pay pressures in future in the health service. Okay, I'll stop there.
Can I just ask you, and this is at the risk of, I know there's a room full of people who know more about these things. I know I was the only one who needed to be told what DRG stood for. I apologise. you were quite sort of diplomatic about that chart showing the community healthcare growth and how this wasn't necessarily what you would expect reading what people say. Can you spell that out just very briefly? I mean, why is that at odds with what you might have expected to see?
Well, so a huge amount of the language in the QUIP strategy and all that people write and talk about in relation to a more efficient and sustainable health service would talk about shifting care from the acute sector, from hospitals, to closer to people's homes, shifting away from a focus on managing people when they're in crisis to preventing crisis. And I think the community health service spend is consistent with that, but the real terms of reduction in primary care, particularly spending on GP services, is not consistent with that. You would expect from what people are saying they want to do strategically to see a shift in resources from acute care to primary care.
Okay, but that's what I was. But you don't think, because I was surprised that you said that about the community care. But that is sort of what you would expect.
You sort of, yes. It's difficult to know what's going on in community care because we collect almost no numbers on it.
The other thing, which is a little bit related, and I did find it sort of tantalising, Mark, when you said one way in which we really had gone against the trend was with this push to decentralisation at a time when many others are pulling in and are centralising in order to get the cost control. You know, briefly, you know, what do you think about that? I mean, looking at it from an international perspective, do you think it's an interesting experiment? Do you think it's mad?
Well, it's certainly interesting. I mean, that's one of the great roles of the England in particular, is to provide evidence to the rest of the world about what doesn't work in health reform.
And rapid changes, discrete changes, which allow a perfect example for econometricians and anybody else.
Indeed, it's wonderful. In terms of what I think, I do find it surprising that the UK alone feels that this move towards more decentralisation is going to actually deliver more efficiency than more centralisation. I mean, if you just look at the list of the countries that are going towards centralisation, you've got Denmark, you've got Sweden, you've got, even in the crisis, you've got Ireland centralising purchasing. I mean, there is an issue about market power, about competence, and I just don't think that small units seem to have sufficient market power in order to get...
And I know we're talking about different bits of the system here, but I mean, that's not at odds with what you're saying about choice.
No, not
because
at all.
When people think about choice, somehow they think, I know it's different sides of the...
Yeah. No, we very much need provider choice, so we want people to be able to, well, in my view, the evidence suggests it is a good idea to allow people to be able to choose their provider. Nevertheless, you still need some strategic decision-making, things like accidents and emergency, things like purchasing. I don't think it will be very easy to get efficiency gains if you move towards smaller and smaller units.